for the year 2022-2023. In today's talk, we have Drs. Jenny Root, Dr. Pam Williamson, and Dr. Kait Brennan. The title of their talk is Faculty Roles in Education Policy, Who, What, When, Why, and How of Advocacy. Dr. Jenny Root is an associate professor of special education. She's also an affiliate faculty at the Florida Center for Reading Research. Dr. Pam Williamson is a professor of special education. She's also the chair of exceptional deaf and interpreter education at the University of North Florida. And Dr. Kait Brennan is a senior policy advisor. Our speakers today will share practical ways for education faculty to successfully engage in advocacy at the local, state, and federal levels. For the attendees, our speaker said that you could put any questions that you have in the chat, but they've structured it so that you also it'll be an interactive session. All right, we look forward to this amazing talk. Thank you for being part of it.
Thanks so much, Amel and the rest of the committee for allowing us to have a slightly different format today. So those of you who've joined our colloquium before, we are not going to be presenting a research study, so it's going to have a little bit different of a format. Instead, as Amel said, we're going to be talking about the roles that we can play as faculty, doctoral students within advocacy for education policy. So I want to give us a chance to introduce ourselves as the panelists, and then in a moment I'm going to ask for you all to tell us, who all's in the audience. So again, I'm Jenny Root. I've been at Florida State for 7 years now. It's kind of hard to believe, and my research focuses on how to have meaningful academic outcomes for students with extensive support needs. So students with autism and intellectual disability, how can we have them engage in the general curriculum? And a little bit about how I got here, interested in policy and advocacy. Recently I was talking with friends about this panel coming up, and feeling like I am new to and learning and growing in my advocacy muscles. But then in talking, I realized we've been doing this all along, right? That advocacy isn't always the formal opportunities that I have in a couple of weeks to go to DC or talking with our representatives here in Tallahassee, but it's within my teaching, within my public school teaching, within my service and tweets. And so I'm excited for all of us to have the chance to welcome our guest panelists as we talk about what the practical ways that we can engage in this work. So I now toss it to Pam and let her introduce herself.
So again, my name's Pam Williamson. I'm really excited to be here today. Policy is something that I've been interested in for a very, very long time. It began actually before I started in the world of education. I formerly was a banker, and I actually was asked to go and advocate on behalf of banking policies way back in the day. And then fast forward, I became a new homeowner, and I wasn't happy with some things that were happening around my neighborhood. And I actually became an elected official for a minute down in the county of Alachua. I was a city commissioner for Alachua County and I served a term in my mid-20s, something like that. And then it was kind of a natural thing for me to continue to be interested. And I had the privilege to work on the TED board as the political action representative, working with the doctoral students, and then I moved on to the HEXI board. I love Jane West dearly, have interacted with her for so long, and I'm really excited that Kait is here with us. But Jane was very important in helping shape how I approach this work and making sure that I am representing both my personal interests, which are different from my public interests, which are very important to the field of education. My area of research really is reading and autism, which is a bit of an aside, but I do think long and hard about how policy helps privilege one thing and another sometimes. And so policy, understanding how policy works is very important. I'm going to toss it to Kait.
Thanks, Pam and Jenny. I'm really excited to be here. Hi, everyone. Kait Brennan, I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for the Higher Education Consortium for Special Education. I also represent the Teacher Education Division of the Council for Exceptional Children and serve as a consultant for the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Educators. So really, kind of going back, I started out my career as a special ed teacher. I worked with students with emotional and behavior disabilities, and had a personnel preparation grant to get my doctorate. I'm a first gen college student, and I always tell everybody there's no chance I ever would have had my PhD without that funding. And I feel really extraordinarily grateful now to have the opportunity to advocate for that funding that can hopefully support a number of students across the country in furthering the good work that you all are doing in terms of education and special ed. But I worked alongside, if you do know Jane, as Pam has mentioned, Jane is a friend and mentor of mine. I had the real privilege of learning and working with her, and then stepped into that role when she transitioned onto other things. So in my current role, I lobby on behalf of those organizations, and really what we look for are, my focus are on what federal levers exist to advance, rebuilding and diversifying the special educator and specialized instructional support personnel pipeline. Generally, at the federal level, we have a few levers that exist, and those come through appropriations, which I'll talk about in a bit, and also through bills. So I'm, again, interface with members of Congress, do that work, and just excited to have the chance to talk with you all, because quite frankly, without the work that you're doing and the stories that we get from people like Jenny and Pam, and I see others on this call, Chris, who I some familiar faces, without knowing all the stuff that you guys are doing on the ground, I can't go to the Hill and do my job. So I'm so extraordinarily grateful for you all and your interest in advocacy, and the folks who reach out and share those stories, because they're just supremely important to this work. So thanks so much for having me.
So our goal today, and sort of the path we're going to take, we're going to talk about the who, what, when, why of advocacy. Here's my teaching coming out, that we want to be really explicit and look at kind of all the dimensions of something that, depending on your doctoral training and your background, you may or may not have any formal familiarity with. And then we're going to get into the how, and that's where the wonderful experience that Pam and Kait have, I think, will really benefit us all. So we're going to start with who does advocacy, who should be involved in that, and who do we interface with? There's, I think, a common sort of belief that, and this is outside of just education in general, that when we see things happening in our society, in our towns, in our schools, in our larger government systems, that someone else hopefully is a part of the solution, right? That surely those people making those decisions are being influenced by somebody. But what I think we need to know is that it should be each of us. We should all be engaged in those conversations. And, like back to the founding, of what makes our country unique and special is that we are a pluralist society. So it's a great quote from Rick Hess about the founders understanding that the public square is enriched by the competing views we have, rooted in different values, experiences, and knowledge. And so if we, as education faculty, as citizens, are not a part of those conversations, then our stories aren't being told. So I want to then, as we think about, well, who engages in advocacy, I would say that everyone that teaches or conducts research in higher ed needs to know about policy and advocacy, because it impacts all of us. And so as higher education leaders, as future higher education leaders for our doctoral students, we can be drivers of change. We don't just have to be passive recipients of outcomes. Because these policies are made by people like us who are influenced by stories and data. And so that's what we will talk through today. So in our role as teacher educators and people who prepare doctoral students and prepare future faculty, I think it's our obligation to also support those our future colleagues in being able to do that work as well. So often there's this thought that there's the policymakers over here, and then us in the ivory tower academics, and we speak totally different languages, and we have a totally different way of being, and that those are not compatible with each other. So certainly there could be some barriers, but understanding the differences of sort of who we are and the culture that we're situated in within our roles as academics, and then also the different priorities and interests of people who are engaged in policymaking.
Jenny, can I just say one thing there?
Yeah.
This reminds me of that research to practice gap often. And it is really important when you're thinking about this in terms of policy, particularly at the federal level. The United States is run by a bunch of 20-something-year-olds that work in Washington, right? They're really important people that staff those offices. And that's generally who you're going to be interfacing with the feds. And so when you're thinking about that, some of those folks have a tremendous amount of experience and background and expertise in education. Some do not. Some have a very wide-ranging portfolio that may go from, armed services through education, right? Or thinking like right now, for example, with the speakership being delayed, the House is still being staffed. There may be one person in there kind of covering everything as new members are coming on. So I think it's really important in education. And I think about this as an educator. I remember talking with my partner and I'd start rattling off like IEP, PBSP, and he was like, you got to stop. It's like your friends are all teachers, so you guys talk like this, but I have no idea what you're speaking about. And so I think it's important for us to keep in mind that when you're talking with policymakers too, that they don't assume that they know or understand what you're talking about, right? But they want to know and they want to understand. And so it's a matter of just kind of like drilling that down into a way that is digestible for that person and that they'll latch on to. I think that's really important. So like whatever is something that, really makes them tick, have that align with, what you're doing. Is within the education space, we have, you all are doing such important work that touches on so many things across the country that you can really, dial that into various spaces based on the person's expertise. So I just kind of wanted to plug that quickly.
Yeah, no, please, and Pam and Kait, jump in so it can be conversational. I think this is maybe just a human tendency to other people of like, if they don't value and think the way I do, then like, how is that possible? When really like, we just have different roles, right? So it's not that, like you said, they don't care, but my scope is right here and they have much more. And so the way that we talk needs to kind of keep the realities of how policymaking happens in mind. So, one of the barriers, I think, to any type of engagement and being responsiveness, whether this is talking about policy or research, is the academic career is so long-term. Like we're thinking like, oh, well, I need to get a grant and IRB and like this, and this. And it, by the nature of that, is too long because in policy land, like the session is now, in Florida, it's 2 months this year. So we need to get things rolling. We need to realize that it's short term. But what that can feel like as an academic is like, I made this relationship and now there's somebody new and now there's somebody new in the staffing of it, not to mention our representatives. Also the passing of time. So as academics, we see things we are trained to see things very linearly, right? And it's inquiry driven versus in the policy space, it's not, it's complex, unpredictable, politically driven. And that's not a bad word. It's a fact, right? The timing is so fast paced in the policy land because they only have so much time and there are so many things that need to be done. So being able to have the right people in the right place at the right time, that's whose stories are going to be heard. And as academics, that can make it difficult for us to see that window of opportunity and to be responsive. The pace, we are not super flexible. And so that inflexibility that's sort of built into our systems can make it difficult or make us feel like it's difficult to keep up. versus, policymakers who they need evidence that's relevant to what they are doing right now, to the bills that are being put forward right now, to the issues the local school board is dealing with, on Tuesday night at 6:30. And then the duration, then they need something that is there right then versus something that's going to be this whole long research process that relates to the sequence. So the order that we have things, if our data or our stories aren't there right when it's time to engage, then we may not be fitting into the policy cycle if we are thinking about it very narrowly. And Kate's going to talk to us more about what is that whole policy cycle and how we can be engaged at all times, not just while, for example, while the Florida legislature is in session. And so it's important that we understand sort of the differences between the land that we might live in academia and the land of policy. Jane West gave in her 4Ps model that we'll talk about kind of the differences between these two lands we live in, right? As far as the currency. So what is valued, what is reinforced, what do we have? It's research and scholarship for us, right? It's data, it's evidence, it's those empirical findings versus in policy land, like they trade in legislative strategy. I think we had a very interesting example of that last week. We value and are motivated by knowledge, right? And answering those inquiries that we have versus power and influence in a policy land. And then what is it that we talk about? Like what language are we using? It's evidence and our own jargon within this space versus thinking about the politics of things and who's in power, who wants to be, what are different priorities. So there are some, before we get into the what, I want to see who everybody is here. So I'm going to put into the chat a tiny URL. So you can go to that to join a Jamboard. Let me switch my sharing. So hopefully you're able, oh yes, I see lots of anonymous animals joining. So hopefully you're able to join this. And I just want to see like who we have here today. So what is your role right now? Not to put you in a box, but we have to have boxes. Oh yes, I see I didn't lock that, but. All right, so see, it looks like we have a lot of FSU faculty and some non-FSU faculty and students, as well as some university staff. Oh, that's interesting. Rob says he got a message of too many people. I've never had that before, but good to know. And explore other things. So I'll let you all keep indicating that so you can see who each other are. And then I'm going to pass it off to Pam to talk about, make sure I'm doing this right. Am I sharing correctly?
We've got the notes and the slide up.
There you go. Better?
Still notes and slide and notes.
Thanks.
It's nice to see all the faces though. So I can go ahead and sort of start talking. So Jenny raised this notion that we have different currencies and our motivations are very different. And one thing that's really important for us to think about is the fact that as educators, we can always be advocates, but we can't always be the lobbyist in those positions because that that's not our job in terms of what we do for a living for our paycheck. That's why we have someone that's wonderful like Kait, who is the person responsible for being our lobbyist and helping convey our information in ways that we work with other organizations that are all interested in the same thing, working on behalf of individuals with disabilities and doctoral granting institutions and people who prepare teachers. So at the same time, making sure that we remember that we are educators. That's part of what we do when we advocate on behalf of our organizations. So we go in and we really want to build relationships with people in the offices. And that is not an understated activity, because what ends up happening is, if once you have a relationship with someone and once they're interested and they see you as someone who supports the work of their boss, which is what they will often refer to the person they work for, their boss, it becomes a reciprocal endeavor where you can really start to share and influence what they're talking about. So for example, I was up in North Carolina and I had the opportunity to go in and talk with our folks up there. And we did a really nice job of sort of being able to share the things that were of interest to our group. And notably, one of the people we met with actually had pulled some of the research of us that we're going to visit, which was a big surprise to all of us. We were like, wow, this person actually took the time to read the information that we had been talking about in our research literature. I can only say that happened one time, but it was really an exciting time. Other times, though, we've had an opportunity, for example, here in Florida, we were asked to provide information on the kinds of earmarks. I know that's a terrible word sometimes, but earmarks just means that they're setting aside funds for something important. But we were asked to participate and create the document of the possible asks that our House of Representatives representative was going to be looking at in terms of their agenda. So that was pretty exciting. And Jane was helping at the time. And so Jane helped me complete that. But had it not been for the relationship there, I'm not sure that we would have been asked to participate at that kind of level. The other thing that's really important is, especially at the national level, is they very often, they're super interested in what's happening locally. The House of Representatives in particular, they're representing a district or an area, and they're eager for those stories of what's going on at home. And for example, I've been asked everything from, tell me about what's happening with the teacher turnover in that area, because nationally we're talking about teacher shortages, to, tell me more about, the doctoral preparation and how that's influencing what happens in my district. So it's really important that we remember first that we're educators, and that's the best way to approach advocacy. You're informing and you're helping them understand what's going on in their local district. When we talk about anything that's a little bit, more sensitive, it's really important to kind of just be very objective, not interject your opinions, because honestly, that doesn't go anywhere. That's not the best way to approach these things. But you really want to develop a relationship, and you really want to be the person that they can ask for information. And once you kind of can really go back and forth with that, it's really important. Jenny, I think, mentioned earlier that frustration of people changing, and they do change. And Kait was explaining that they're in the process of hiring their staff. But I'm going to tell you, some of the staff members that I've worked with are incredibly brilliant, bright people, and they have an awful lot on their plate. And if you can be the person who can share with them inside information that will make their job a little bit easier, that can go a really, really long way to kind of pushing up our research agenda, our agenda for supporting teachers and students and those involved in the process of educating our students. So that can be a really important thing. So, and it even goes, when I was working in North Carolina, I had a really good relationship, and I would just send pieces that I thought were interesting. I would send like something really short, and I wouldn't send them my whole research paper, but I might send a little email. Here, I found this today, or I was reading this today. I thought this little bit might be of interest. So that's another thing that has worked well for me in the past. And then if we want to go to the next, does anyone want to add anything to that, Jenny?
Yeah, I was wondering, Kait, did you want to add anything about lobby?
Yeah, I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute too. But I think the thing to keep in mind when people see the word lobbying, I think especially in higher ed, there's this like panic. There's a very clear definition of what lobby is and very clear thresholds that you have to meet, including being paid for doing it, including the amount of time that you spend where you technically have to file as a lobbyist. It is difficult, right, for anybody who's a faculty member to meet those thresholds, even if you're somebody who is engaging with your legislature with regularity. So just I think people get a little bit nervous sometimes of like, oh, I'm not sure I want to interact because we're not really supposed to do that. It's okay. You're not going, nobody's going to come and find you and say that you're lobbying, and that's wrong. I do think it's, just to Pam's point, important that, you know, you maintain these relationships. Staff members do turnover, but in the federal government, you often see them kind of moving between either the department or other spaces, or then they leave and they become a lobbyist or come back. And so the people kind of stay in the circle no matter sort of where they land. But that point, and Jenny touched on this earlier too, is that it's not just that like one shot on your fly-in, it's the year-round stuff that you do all the time, because otherwise, you know, it's just like you're just kind of another face that shows up there. And you have to keep in mind every single person that's going to talk to these people, whatever their problem is that they're presenting, is the most important problem in the world to them. And so you have to make the case that your problem is the most important problem in the world, and also that your solution is the most important and best way to go about it. Nobody wants you to come and just talk to you about the problems. They get it. You can, but it's critical though that you say, hey, I acknowledge that this is what's going on, and here's what, you know, something that an opportunity that exists in your space, and also, you know, here's evidence of how this is working. Look at what I'm doing. And then I think just understanding too, like, what are those levers? So for example, like the federal level, there's a lot going on in terms of education that's happening at the states right now. The feds in a lot of ways can't touch that. And so like, what are the federal levers that are available? What are the state levers? What are your county levers? What are your school district levers? So really understanding like who is holding that power to make those choices, and who and what should you be advocating for, kind of I really loved that chart that Jenny had, sort of the difference between academia and policy, I think is really strong. So just wanted to kind of throw those tidbits in.
So this is such an important quote. Truth telling is academia's privilege and obligation. Scholars have nothing but the truth to offer. If they abandon that, then they've lost everything. So in your own minds, it is critical that we kind of think about the difference between you know, facts and our beliefs and opinions about things, because really and truly it's critical that when we're having these opportunities, that we're stepping back from perhaps our beliefs and our opinions about things and really trying to bring the evidence that we have. And when on the other hand, when those things are shared with us, then we want to listen intensely. I can remember being on the Hill in a visit when Betsy DeVos was being confirmed. That was pretty controversial. And I can remember some folks in my group having some seriously strong opinions about all of that. But at the end of the day, we very carefully shared the information that we had about our concerns and kind of left it there. In all honesty, out of all the very large numbers of visits I've done over time, that was probably the most uncomfortable I felt ever, because there were some really passionate people in the room thinking about how important it was that we didn't have her running our system. At the same time, you know, I don't really think that it made any difference. And I feel as though what really does make a difference is when we share our truth, which is our facts, our evidence, our information. Here's what teacher turnover looks like in our area. Here are the things that have supported. Like, we have one of my favorite stories ever was we called on our Congress and senators, our Congress people and senators, asking for money for TQP, the Teacher Quality Partnership grants. And what would happen every year for a long, long time is the Senate would have it in their appropriations, but the House never, ever did. And it would always get picked up in the reconciliation process. And then one day, lo and behold, we all showed up for our HEXI meeting, and one of the representative staffers was at our panel discussion, and he said, guess what? You guys have a win here. We actually have money this time in our first pass for TQP grants, and that's because you guys have consistently told us how important those are to your districts and to your systems. And so that was pretty exciting, because then it just makes those conversations a little easier when they've already actually prioritized it and put money in it, instead of us having to always consistently say, you don't have any here, but this is really important. I've worked at 2 universities that have had those. They're really important grants. So those are a couple of stories that come to mind about the privilege and the obligation, telling them, this helps support our school districts. This helps support our local school districts. This is what happens when teachers have the opportunity to be in these residency programs, and they're funded and they are paid a living stipend. That was our privilege and obligation to share with policymakers who are pretty far removed from it sometimes. Anyone else want to add anything there? So here we go, is another great quote. Even the most settled and trustworthy scholarship will not be persuasive unless due attention is given to the beliefs in politics that shape and filter our public discourse. So when I think about some of this kind of thing, I really do think a lot about policymaking. A lot of times, if we think back historically, what's happened is that sometimes the policies have been ahead of where the research is. So thinking, for example, about LRE, least restrictive environment, that was put in policy before we knew a whole lot about how that would work. Or collaboration on IEP team meetings. Those were ideas that came in policy before we were actually in the midst of it. So we kind of ended up having to do the reverse, where the policy was ahead of the scholarship. But it's also important to understand that our scholarship is compelling when we speak our hearts and mind through our politics, or through our work, because helping people understand the importance of what we do and sharing our stories only breaks through to policymakers when they know about it. So it's not good enough for us to keep talking to each other, I guess is the easiest way for me to sum this up. We do have to share our stories, and we have to share what's important to us in an evidence-based way.
All right. So Jenny has this slide up here, and I think, something that we wanted to sort of transition into is talking about educator preparation, right? And so when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about the field, the greatest issue facing our field right now is the critical shortage of educators, especially special educators and specialized instructional support personnel, who are qualified, right, to do the job. So I think that's really important. Not that we're just getting anybody with a beating heart into the classroom, but they have gone through a comprehensive educator preparation program and have, really that specific skill set. And we are fortunate within the field of special ed that we do have the personnel requirements under IDEA Part B. But when we're thinking about this, what we go to policymakers with is really looking at, kind of what's happening right now. And I talked a little bit before about sort of what we're seeing in the states and that type of thing. And, there's only certain federal levers that we do have available to us, but we've got them. And so I think it's really, really important for us to look at, okay, here are the problems that we're facing. And then federally, we do have some solutions for those, right? And so let's really tap into that. So I'll quickly run through these. You all know this. We're seeing, increases in the number of folks who are getting into classrooms who are not qualified to do their jobs, right? And we know this is not only just an education issue, this is a civil rights issue. I mean, special ed is a civil rights law, and we know who is most impacted by this. It's students of color, students with disabilities, students living in areas of high concentrations of poverty. There's a lot of discourse right now going on about the educator shortage, and people are saying things things like, it's not everywhere, or it's this or it's that. Well, if it's in every major city in America, in every major urban area, then yes, it is across the nation. And special ed, I always say, we're the best worst example. Even prior to the pandemic, we were the area with the greatest level of need. And moving through there, we've had just a number of data that's come out recently from the department that indicates that actually special education personnel and bus drivers are the most challenging positions to fill at this time. We also, have a real mismatch between the racial, ethnic, and gender distributions of the workforce. So, teaching was a field that was made for white married women. Right. And we haven't really fundamentally changed how we recruit or prepare or retain teachers since then. So we do see, an overrepresentation of white women in the field because, the field was catered towards that. Right. So we need to fundamentally change, how we're going about reaching folks in the field. And I think we have some exciting opportunities ahead of us. But really, what are the opportunities then? Like I said before, you can't just go in with the problems. You have to go in with the problems and the solution. And what I always say to folks is like, hey, if we're lowering the standards for educators, we're lowering the standards for every other profession in America. We would not be okay if I said that, hey, in this poor community, in this predominantly Black community, the doctors don't have to go to med school. Right. But we're okay with teachers being in the classroom who haven't gone through a comprehensive educator prep program. That's not okay. And so I think, bringing things to light, and to Pam's point earlier, is making this kind of hit a chord with whatever that person's area may be. Right. So you can think about the economic implications for teacher turnover, right? Across the aisle, people are worried about that. And so thinking about, how does this align? I've worked with members on the Armed Forces Committee before, where we've talked about, the educator shortage is leading to some and underqualified folks who are teaching our students, which is leading to us having, students who are leaving public education who may not be prepared to enter the military, right? We have to then do a number of sort of things on the back end is to get kids, and you're seeing this right now, right, with the recruits. There was stuff going on with, I think, health and wellness, and then we're talking now about just some of the academic outcomes. So again, we have this really great opportunities here to think about, what are those federal policies. From my end, what we advocate for is IDEA Part D, the Teacher Quality Partnership Grant Program, which Pam alluded to earlier, the Augustus F. Hawkins Centers for Excellence, and the National Center for Special Education Research, NICSR funding. Those are the 4 areas that TED and HEXI generally goes after. We're also a part of a number of coalitions. We do a lot of work in coalitions where we do things like Title II, the Education, Innovation, and Research Fund, funds. There's a number of other, it's not like we just focus in on those 4, but essentially what us as lobbyists do is we sort of split up, like where's your sweet spot, and you take those and you're like really the driver on that. But we support a number of things otherwise. This meaningful consultation with stakeholders is especially critical, and Pam and Jenny have both already talked about that. And then the Higher Ed Act and teacher prep, timing, to go back to that great slide Jenny had before, a lot of people ask me things like, well, maybe we could do this through a reauthorization of IDEA. And I'm just like, oh, please do not open that. And so there's, when you want to really think about the timing, to understand, what's the political climate right now for the things that you're doing. And so just to look here, I love this quote here: public debates and decisions benefit when all talents are brought to the table, right? So making sure, and we'll say this kind of like ad nauseum, I say, is that if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And we have to make sure that we're getting everybody to the table. So really looking here is, defining the issue very clearly, figuring out your agenda, doing the policy formation, the adoption, the implementation, and evaluation. I laughed a little bit when Jenny was talking about policy is kind of moving quickly and higher ed on this like slower end where, sometimes in policy, we feel like it's like, oh my gosh, we just cannot, like, we've been trying to move this for forever and it's not moving. But then there are other times where you get a request and it's like, yeah, we needed it yesterday. So it's sort of, you can have this, we call it the hurry up and wait in DC a lot of times. But it is true. So I wish that things always were as nice and neat as this slide presents it, but the truth of policymaking is that it's very messy, it's nonlinear. But this generally is how you want to go about things, right? Is having that clearly defined issue. I think about it from like the special ed teacher lens, right? If we need a clearly defined behavior, we need a clearly defined issue. And then what's our strategy for going forth? And there's always power in numbers and collective messaging. I think that's the one thing that we're working on federally. That's really important with the other policy advocates and lobbyists is, how are we all going to go at this together? Because the greatest issue right now is workforce issues across the board, whether it's special ed or otherwise. So, how do we really make a compelling argument? And Jenny, can we go on to the next slide? Because I think I'll cover some of what I was just going to say moving forward.
So as we move into talking about starting into the why, what's the benefit? I think we do have to acknowledge the hesitations we might be feeling, right? Of like, why not? Why aren't maybe all of us involved? And I think there are various reasons, but I do want 35 of you, I guess, if we have a moment, or you can certainly type in the chat. I'll share this, the Jamboard slide as well. I'm just curious because we represent a really diverse sort of collection of educators. It's important to remember what our why is. So why did we get into the areas that we are? And especially as you go into doctoral training, you really need to like that reason because you're going to be with it for a little bit. But as most people I talk to, most educators and teacher educators, our why has something to do with our own personal experiences as a student, as a parent, as a family member, as a teacher, right? And we think about, well, this is why I chose to come into this area. So you can use a sticky note if you'd like, or type into the chat or think to yourself, right? Of what's your why for what you do? So I think about when I had a phenomenal preparation to be a beginning special education teacher. And I had learned how to teach all students to read even then. So I knew how to teach students with limited speech and intellectual disability how to read, but I looked around at my other teachers and they did not. The other special ed teachers for whatever reason. So it wasn't anything magical about me. It was, I had been trained and I knew how. But what that ended up being for students was some students learned to read and some did not. And it was totally based on an arbitrary reason of who their teacher was and what their training was. And that's a determining life factor for their quality of life, of whether they're learning how to read or not. And so that's part of my why, is those inequities in academic outcomes and what are, that's a research agenda, but it's also a teacher education. I embed that within my classes. It's how I advocate and what I talk about. So we think about what our why is, right? What are those issues that we are passionate about, whether it's professionally or personally. But then if you look at the next screen, you can start to capture but what are you concerned about regarding that? Why might you not? What are the barriers and what are the needs? Because that's where you're going to get the stories that go with the data to convince in a very short amount of time the policymakers that you're able to interact with. So I'll leave you all to answering some of those questions, and then maybe more seamlessly switch to back to our slides. So Kait, if you want to keep going about why not.
I think this why not too is important. I think about this a lot because your stories and your voices are so important, but academia really isn't set up to reinforce you to do advocacy work, right? You all have a ton of other things on your plate, and really, like, are reinforced more by your publications and things like that. This isn't something that's looked at as a line of service or otherwise, and so it's difficult. I mean, I get that. It's adding something on top of your already extraordinarily busy careers and lives that is directly impacts it, and that you're a critical player at, but isn't necessarily reinforced by your employers. And so I think that's just something to keep in mind. Jenny, I know that we have coming up some of the stories, but just looking at the time, do you mind if I do that? Oh no, here, go ahead. Sorry. I was just going to say to the 4 Ps and then do the success stories. Is that okay?
Yes. You just tell me when to move
Perfect.
forward.
So I think we were going to touch on kind of some of these success stories of how this works, but I think it's really important for us to put this into a framework. And this will be coming from Jane's forthcoming text or book that will be coming out in May. But really, you want to look at, you've got the people, the players, the policy, the politics, the players, and the process, right? And anybody who tells you that we should remove politics from policy doesn't work in either policy or politics. You just can't. And so you have to keep that in mind whenever you are advocating. That being said, I do not recommend that you go in to, explain to people why maybe you disagree with their politics, or why fundamentally what they're doing is not something that aligns with your personal or professional beliefs. Stay away from partisan conversations. You're in there to make a compelling argument for the solutions that you have to the critical problems that are facing the field. The politics behind some of this. So I talked a little bit just earlier about reopening IDEA or the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act. I'm not here to heroize or villainize one party over the other, right? I work with both of them. And so I have some pretty inside, understanding of how just these humans work. But there's just some fundamental differences in the ways that the two parties, and we live in a 2-party system in America, believe that what the role of the federal government is. Democrats generally believe in more government, Republicans generally believe in less. When I'm going to advocate then for things that I need more government oversight on, I may, my Republican colleagues may be interested, right, in what I'm talking about and supportive of it from a theoretical standpoint, but the politics don't necessarily align. So I've had folks where they've said to me, Kait, hey, I'm with you, but find a different mechanism for this to go through rather than reconciliation, because I'm never going to vote for that. It's just not something that I can possibly vote for, even though I'm agreeing with you that, yes, I do think there should be more funding to go towards addressing the critical shortage of educators, but find me a different way that I can do this that aligns with my politics. You have to keep in mind too that, those folks are voted in for a reason, and they're voted in by their constituents. And that's why I think, to Jenny's point earlier and to Pam's, is that, your voices really matter, because particularly, it's obviously in the Senate, but particularly in the House, is you hire them, you fire them, and you pay their salaries, right? They exist in that space because of the voters. There's a really, really great quote, and it's, a kind of paraphrase, which is, people believe that government's kind of this foreign body over you. And it's not. It's this, there's no greater person of power in this country than the voters, right? That's who puts the people in. So I think it's really critical that we understand who are the people involved. This changes at every different layer of advocacy, whether you're doing this at the federal, state, county, or school district level, right? So you need to know who are the people involved. In DC, it's going to be not only Congress and the executive branch, but it's going to be your think tanks, it's going to be your lobbyists, it's going to be academics, it's going, there's a number of different groups, and how those folks all play together really influences both that policy and the process. Understanding the politics is critical in terms of timing. There's a lot of things right now with IDEA that I wish we could reopen to, quite frankly, do some reauthorization, because some of the policy priorities that I have would be easier done through a reauthorization. There's no chance that I'm advocating for a reauthorization of IDEA right now, because of fundamentally, with certain leadership in the way that IDEA is written, I don't believe it would look the same, right? Because there is a lot of federal oversight within that that's unique, especially right now with schools kind of being at the crux of these partisan conversations. The process is extremely important, and Jenny talked about this earlier on that chart. The one thing I want to say though is, and particularly at the state level, states are interesting because your congressional, your General Assembly schedules are a bit different. There's a lot of things that kind of happen back, like closed door and that type of thing. If you feel like you missed something, right? Or like, oh, that time, like, all right, the time's passed. It hasn't, right? You just have to keep going and knocking that door down. And I think the most important thing is not to go in and tell someone like, that was wrong, that was wrong, that was wrong. The more important thing is to go in and say, this is the solution, this is the solution, this is the solution. If people are coming up and if your focus is really on comprehensive educator prep, I don't think you need to spend a whole lot of time talking about like, hey, that was wrong to do this alternative cert program. It was wrong, it was wrong, it was wrong. You go in and talk to them about the benefits of comprehensive educator prep, and just quite frankly, what the data shows whenever that's not in place, which is that we see increases in teacher turnover, we see poor academic and behavior outcomes for students, and so on and so forth. And that's sort of how then, you know, all of these things interconnect, and that's how we get to that policy making process. It is not something that is in any way linear, but it is extraordinarily critical that all of those players are involved. And I think it's just really, really important too, to understand the hierarchy as well of sort of what's happening and when it's happening and how things are situated. I was talking with somebody recently and I asked, you know, have you ever seen education like this before, really being at the kind of middle ground for some of these political conversations? And they actually referred me to an education historian because they really couldn't think of another time. And part of that is that because, you know, strategists who are above my pay grade had worked to run campaigns based on schools, and it worked. And so they're going to continue to do that because that's how people are getting elected. There's definitely, you know, people talk a lot about like the suburban white women in America. And I think there's, you know, we talked like, there's a saying, they say sometimes like white men drive the car and suburban white women put the gas in it. And so they really leaned into, you know, how are these kind of swing voters, which generally suburban white women are, can go one way or the other in terms of Republican or Democratic candidates. What's something that we can lean into? And they leaned into schools. And I think you're going to see that for quite some time in a similar way that we saw Roe before used as a mechanism for voting.
Can I add a little something?
Sure.
So the thing that I was thinking about when you were speaking, Kait, was the importance of understanding at a practical level which committees your folks serve on, talking about the hierarchy. So for example, at the federal level, if your members are serving on the health committee, it's important for you to know that and for us to know that because they're actually working in the areas that we care deeply about. So having an understanding also even at the state level, what are the committees that your representatives serve on and your senators serve on is a really important thing for you to be knowledgeable about, so that when you go to advocate, you really are hitting within their zone of influence. It helps you understand how deep you can go with the conversation versus a quicker ask, sign on, join on a bill or something. It's much more of an intricate conversation where you want to develop the relationship so you can help really shape what they learn about and know about.
This is a really great slide. And I'll let Jenny kind of walk you through all of this. But the one thing that I'll just say is that, you know, your expertise is really critically important to this work. And I highly encourage everyone, to start building those relationships with folks based on what your areas of interest and expertise are, right? Today I was talking a lot about the educator shortage. That's what my focus is on. But, tapping into what you don't, I think a lot of times this all can seem overwhelming. And you don't need to know everything that's going on in terms of the politics or the policy. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be a policy wonk. You just have to know what you do, right? Nobody knows you and your story better than you. And I think especially for the doc students who are on this call, if you are funded from, a federal grant, it's extremely important that you're there telling your story, and how you got to be there, what the impact of that funding has been, how you're going to go on and impact the field, because you are the return on investment. Right? There's nobody better than the doc students a lot of times to go out and do some of this advocacy work, because just that one investment in one person, the trickle down that you all have is extraordinary. And so I think it's just, making sure that even if this seems really out of maybe your space or overwhelming or what have you, that you keep in mind that like you are the expert, and it's important for you to be at the table and to be a resource for people. And that's kind of how too that you've created these really strong relationships, which this isn't to suggest you don't have a strong relationship if this doesn't happen, but when people reach out to you for something, right, that's something that really shows like they know, and they want that resource for them, and they want to be able to say, hey, in my district, this is what's happening. At Florida State, this is what's going on. Like this is why we need this, because these are the people I represent, and this is what matters to me.
And above all, vote every single election. It's critical that that every single person vote in every single election, no matter how small the election. If there's just one issue on the ballot, the only way that we have our ability to make a difference is we have to vote every time.
Yeah. So I would say these steps for engaging in advocacy, I have learned from Kait and from Jane, but especially that I don't think we can ever emphasize enough that knowing, practicing, and refining your story, right? Your why, your proposed solutions, why that is, why this matters to you, and how you've seen it. And again, especially in education, where even if it might not be somebody's exact wheelhouse, no one can be an expert in everything, including staffers and legislators. But how can we know what their interests and priorities are and have our stories, match that, so then they can then go and use that anecdote. And then, I do think it's our responsibility to some degree stay engaged with what's happening. I know my own can get, one way or the other, this like emotional investment, and I have this instinct to just kind of disconnect. And you have to do what keeps you mentally and emotionally healthy. But it is important to know as things happen, and so whether you're on Twitter or you review FSU's, I'll show you in a minute, the government affairs website that has their briefs, but just kind of being aware of those things is important, because then you never know when kind of the opportunity might come up for you to make a contribution. And then, at that local level, attending school board meetings, they are here in Leon County, they're on Facebook Live. It's how I like to spend one Tuesday evening a month. And so we can know what's going on, that our student teachers are placed in. What are the policies, so that they can be involved. And then finally, public scholarship. So our scholarship, our tweets, maybe our articles, our interviews that we do, the way that we engage with the public to translate scholarship and our findings in a more public friendly way is important. And so I said, stay tuned, because faculty at FSU, this is our College of Ed's Academy of Scholars focus for this spring semester, is going to be on how to engage in public scholarship. So there's a forum coming up on January 26th, I believe. It's in the newsletter. And then we're going to have a series of webinars that'll be in a podcast format, just a quick digestible bite of how to engage in public scholarship, because that is a part of our advocacy. As we close, I want to make you aware of these kind of organizations and acronyms that we've discussed. So AACTE is the sort of national group on teacher education. And then we have FACTI, which is the Florida chapter that our college is involved in. We are at FSU members of HEXI. And so those resources are definitely available to all of our doctoral students, but other faculty and students as well, and then the teacher education division of special ed. But AACTE is having 75 days, 75 ways to advocate for education. So you can go to their website and see some of these quick tips. I think it's really interesting to see the wide variety of people that are submitting them, and it might give you an idea or inspiration for how to do that through your research teaching service. With that, it is 2:00. So my last note is to know that FSU does have a governmental relations office, and Clay Ingram, who is the current Chief Legislative Affairs Officer, is a former Escambia County teacher and an FSU alum. And so, wow, I did not know that until I did some research, but wow, how awesome it is to have an advocate like that for our university and for our schools and our students. So with that, I will stop sharing and say again, thank you so much to Pam and to Kait for joining us, and for Amel giving us this opportunity.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm going to put my email in the chat. If anybody ever wants to reach out, happy to talk.
Thanks, Kait.
So we are at 2:00, which is technically the end of our symposium or allocated time for this colloquium. I don't know what your schedule is like, Jenny, Pam, and Kait, but as Kait said, she has her email in the chat. And Jenny and Pam, I know that you offered your email also at the beginning slide.